A flight attendant laughed when a black CEO said, "Be gentle with my baby," but the silence that followed ended up costing $32 million. A flight attendant laughed when a black CEO calmly said, "Be gentle with my baby," thinking it was just words. He didn't realize that silence would cost him and his airline $32 million. Subscribe if you believe arrogance always collapses when true authority speaks. "Be gentle with my baby," Dr. Oleron Miles said calmly, extending the soft Navy carrier toward the waiting arms of the flight attendant. The request hung in the air like a fragile thread, simple and precise. But the reply it earned was anything but respectful. "Relax," came the reply, followed by a sharp, dismissive laugh. The attendant, tall, lean, his badge reading Turn J, snorted and muttered with a smirk curling the corner of his lip, "They bounce." The words struck the air with quiet violence. Not loud, not angry, but wrong. Completely, undeniably wrong. Several nearby passengers turned to the sound of it. One man in two blinked as though he had misheard. A woman across the aisle instinctively lowered her e-reader, her brow creased in confusion. The low hum of settling bodies and overhead bins seemed to pause for a breath. Oleron froze, not in fear, but in calculation. His gaze didn't harden, but it didn't soften either. It simply locked on Turn's face, studying every tick of amusement that played behind those narrow eyes. For a man like Oleron, composure wasn't a tactic, it was his nature. But this moment required more than composure. It required presence. Still, his voice remained steady, even as his hand instinctively tightened around the carrier's strap. He had experienced veiled disrespect before, coded tones in boardrooms, sideways glances in executive lounges, forced smiles hiding assumptions. But this felt different, sharper. It wasn't about the baby. It wasn't even about the joke. It was about the man who said it, and the man he assumed he was speaking to. Turn leaned slightly closer, lips still twitching from his own remark. He didn't apologize. He didn't look unsure. He looked entertained, as if the very act of challenging a father's request made his shift more interesting. His hands hovered momentarily above the carrier, but then retracted, as if to signal that he alone would choose when to act. Oleron glanced down at Kalen. The infant stirred softly, a tiny hand brushing against the side of Oleron's chest, grounding him. In that small gesture, the stakes crystallized, not in words or contracts or dollar signs, but in breath and heartbeat. Kalen's presence wasn't an accessory to the trip. He was the reason Oleron had chosen the most secure seat, the reason he had reviewed flight protocols in advance, the reason this moment mattered more than anything that had come before it. Turn, oblivious, turned slightly and began assisting a different passenger with a stowage bin, still chuckling faintly. As he moved away, his shoulder deliberately brushed against Oleron's. Not forcefully, but just enough to convey a message. It was the kind of touch designed to test boundaries, to provoke reaction without consequence. Oleron didn't react. Not visibly, but his mind had already begun to map the pattern. Tone, proximity, dismissal, a layered hostility that disguised itself as casual indifference. The first-class cabin of Austrian Air Flight 742 was a soft glow of amber lights and plush detailing, a bubble of muted luxury suspended 30,000 feet above accountability. But in that instant, it became a stage. Oleron wasn't just a father traveling with his child. He was the one variable that Turn had not expected to push back. As Oleron settled into seat 1A, he adjusted the carrier, so Kalen remained close to his chest. The blanket tucked gently around the baby's side rose and fell with each breath. The priority suite had been arranged in advance, direct aisle access, extra elbow room, and an upgraded safety enclosure for child travelers. He had even double-checked the specs himself after finalizing the $32 million presentation packet stashed securely in his briefcase. Every move, every plan had been deliberate, but this interaction had not been anticipated. And it wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a warning sign, a symptom of a deeper disregard for safety and dignity masquerading as routine procedure. As the final passengers boarded and the overhead bins snapped shut, Oleron's mind moved like a chessboard. He made no assumptions, but he made observations. He observed that Turn hadn't smiled genuinely once since the encounter. That Turn kept glancing back toward him even while helping others. That his colleague, a younger man with neatly parted hair and a badge labeled DULT, had watched the moment unfold with an unreadable expression. That expression, curious, uncertain, slightly tense, was not lost on Alaron. It was the look of someone who hadn't decided yet whether to laugh with the aggressor or step out of the way. The kind of look Alaron had seen in boardrooms during takeovers and negotiations, when silence meant survival and speaking up meant trouble. Kalen cooed softly. Alaron gently rocked him, the motion smooth and practiced. Still watching, still waiting. From across the aisle, a businessman who had been adjusting his cufflinks met Alaron's eyes and offered a nod, not of greeting, but of acknowledgement. He had seen it too. The overhead lights dimmed as the jet's final boarding chime echoed through the cabin. The doors sealed with a hydraulic hiss. All routes of retreat vanished. Now it was just air, altitude, and whatever came next. Tern strolled back down the aisle once more, this time without speaking. His gaze brushed over Alaron and lingered for half a second too long. There was no service in his step, no hospitality in his posture, only a quiet dare. Alaron's instincts stirred again. The board meeting in Velmora was hours away. His biotech partnership pitch was already pre-approved. His rivals at Senvis Biogen were watching for any sign of weakness or delay. Everything depended on smooth, uninterrupted progress. But Smooth had already left the runway. He looked back at Kalen, whose small hand now rested peacefully on his chest. This flight was not going to be routine. It had already begun writing its own narrative, one where a father's request for gentleness was met with laughter, and where the man who laughed had no idea who he had just challenged. Because while passengers whispered and attendants moved, Alaron Miles remained still, alert, and ready. And Tern's smirk, still lingering as he walked past, didn't realize the ripple he had set in motion. A joke can echo louder than the speaker ever expects. Tern's hand shot forward without warning, seizing the strap of the baby carrier with a force far beyond what was necessary for inspection. The motion wasn't aggressive enough to be classified as violent, but it wasn't careful either, and it certainly wasn't professional. The strap jerked, pulling slightly against Kalen's shoulder. The infant flinched, his small body recoiling instinctively, a brief whimper escaping him before Alaron's hand intercepted with swift precision, steadying the strap and halting the tension from traveling further. Gentle, Alaron said, the word flat and firm. Not loud, not angry, but final. Tern paused, his smirk freezing in place, as if caught between amusement and something colder. His fingers hovered over the strap for a second too long before he withdrew them with a scoff. Didn't mean anything by it, he muttered, brushing imaginary lint from his sleeve as though that made the gesture less hostile. Alaron didn't reply. He lowered the carrier gently to the floor beside his leg, making sure the base was steady, and draped the protective blanket more securely over Kalen. His son stirred again, his hand grasping the lapel of Alaron's blazer. That small grip, that innocent instinct for closeness, was all it took to center him. Marvin Dalt, the second attendant, lingered a few steps behind Tern, his posture taut with uncertainty. He watched the exchange with a half-raised brow and parted lips, as if he couldn't decide whether to intervene or let it unfold. His eyes darted from Alaron to Tern, then back to the baby. Still, he said nothing. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it pulsed. Several passengers in the front rows had turned their heads. One man tilted his newspaper downward, his brows knitting in silent question. Another, seated in 2B, leaned closer to his window, as if withdrawing from the tension he sensed brewing across the aisle. From a corner of his vision, Alaron noticed it all. He had long since learned how to read the undercurrent in a room, an acquired skill sharpened in boardrooms where silence meant more than speeches. But this wasn't a boardroom. This was a sealed aircraft at 30,000 feet, where the wrong kind of silence could stretch into complicity. Tern cleared his throat and mumbled, just following procedure. No procedure calls for yanking a child, Alaron replied without looking up. His voice was lower this time. Not a warning, an assessment. Tern didn't answer, but his smirk returned, thinner now, more rehearsed. And beneath it, Alaron sensed something deeper than arrogance, something bitter. The kind of resentment that wasn't sparked by a single moment, but stored over time, waiting for the right target. Alaron could feel it narrowing in on him, disguised as protocol, but driven by presumption. Then came a look, quick but not subtle. Tern cast a glance at Marvin, who gave a hesitant shrug, as if to say, "You started it." They weren't aligned, but they shared enough complicity to keep moving forward with plausible deniability. The intercom chirped softly overhead as the pilot announced cruising altitude. Meanwhile, the tension on the ground, inside row 1, remained unspoken yet unmistakable. Aleron leaned back in his seat, his fingers lightly brushing Kalen's soft cap, ensuring it hadn't shifted. He didn't want his son exposed to cold air or cold eyes. He could have let the moment pass. He could have focused on the contract waiting in his briefcase. The $32 million biotech partnership, the one with the power to redefine postnatal treatment logistics across 3 nations, was just inches from his foot, nestled in encrypted files. But right now, none of that mattered. Kalen's comfort, Kalen's safety, that came first. The deal could wait. A subtle whisper rippled across the aisle. "Did you see that?" murmured the man in 1C. "Yeah," came the hushed response. He tugged the carrier too hard. The baby flinched. "He told him to be gentle," said another voice from the second row. Aleron didn't react outwardly, but he heard it all. He registered each word, each tone, each witness. The memory, stored not in fear, but in precision. Turned, perhaps sensing he was being watched now, adjusted his posture. He busied himself pretending to take inventory on a small tablet, but his glances betrayed his discomfort. Still, there was no apology, no course correction. Dramatic irony began to gather like fog before a storm. Tern believed he had the upper hand, that this was just another moment where a passenger could be baited, belittled, and dismissed. He had no idea who Aleron was. More importantly, he had no idea what Aleron carried, not just in his arms, but in his resolve, in his foresight. Aleron tapped his thumb gently against the rim of the carrier. His ring, black-banded and sleek, vibrated once in silent acknowledgement. He wasn't recording yet, but he had already made the decision that if there was a second incident, if the line was crossed again, there would be a record. And once the truth was preserved, consequences would become non-negotiable. Marvin passed by again with a cart. He paused briefly. "Can I offer anything, sir?" His voice was polite, measured, but his eyes scanned Aleron with faint worry. Not for Aleron's sake, for the aftermath that was beginning to creep closer. Aleron shook his head. "No, thank you." As Marvin moved down the aisle, Aleron looked ahead, briefly catching a reflection in the polished bulkhead wall. Kalen's carrier, his own face, turned shoulder disappearing into the galley. The image was quiet, but it told a story already in motion. Aleron had seen men like Tern before, men who mistook calm for compliance, who couldn't recognize authority unless it arrived with thunder. But thunder wasn't necessary when you understood timing. And this wasn't the time for noise. It was the time for memory, for calm observation, for patience. Because some men don't learn from warnings. They ignore them, mock them, and some warnings are ignored only once. Tern brushed past Aleron's shoulder as he moved down the aisle, a subtle movement dressed as an accident. But the contact was unmistakable. It wasn't forceful, it was deliberate in the way a whisper in a courtroom is deliberate, quiet enough to deny, sharp enough to cut. Aleron didn't react. His face remained calm, eyes tracking forward, but internally, a switch flipped. Every detail, Tern's gait, the shift of his weight, the tone of friction between uniform fabric and skin, registered with the precision of a man who had studied pressure before delivering it. He adjusted Kalen's carrier gently, ensuring it remained secure beside his seat. The baby stirred, then quieted again with the soft rhythm of Aleron's hand. Outside, clouds passed like curtains over the windows. Inside, the cabin carried that false quiet common to first class, a silence that was more about money than peace. 20 minutes passed. Aleron watched the drink cart approach. Marvin Dahl, the second attendant, handled most of the service. He offered drinks, nodded politely, asked passengers if they preferred still or sparkling water. But when the cart rolled near Aleron's row, it slowed, skipped, and then continued past without pause. Aleron waited. 5 more rows. Then the cart disappeared behind the curtain. Another 15 minutes passed. Then Tern returned alone, not with the professionalism of an apologetic attendant, but with a grin carved too wide across his face. He held a single bottle of water and a napkin. No tray, no excuse. "Forgot you," he said casually, as if forgetting a parent and infant on a priority manifest was a thing that happened often. The napkin landed on the tray table like a thrown card. "Water," he added, no inflection, no apology. His eyes flicked to the child, then to Aleron, and finally, subtly, to the briefcase at Aleron's feet. Aleron offered a single nod, then turned slightly, cracking the latches of the briefcase with deliberate quiet. Inside were not just business papers, but leverage. Documents that outlined a $32 million biotech merger, a transfer of rights, a strategic joint venture proposal with Astraenair's medical transport wing. The deal was fragile, timed precisely with the summit awaiting him in Velmora City. The briefcase represented months of planning. But what caught his attention now wasn't the papers. It was the way Tern looked at them, like a man watching a vault he couldn't open. Yet, is he always this selective? A voice murmured beside him. Aleron turned. The passenger across the aisle, a man perhaps in his late 40s with quiet eyes and a low voice, leaned in slightly. His name tag read Ryden Voss. Likely a business traveler, though his attire was plain. He's targeting you, Ryden said again, more softly this time. I know, Aleron replied, his voice calm, nearly indifferent. But his eyes did not stray from the briefcase. Tern returned twice more during the next half hour, not to offer service, but to hover, to linger just long enough to be noticed, just short enough to be defensible. Aleron noted the angle of Tern's head each time, how it tilted just slightly toward the briefcase. He wondered if Tern even understood how much he was giving away. The man thought he was intimidating him. He didn't realize he was being watched just as closely. Aleron pulled out a pen, scribbled a note on the edge of a folder, and slipped it between two documents. Then he angled the briefcase sideways so it blocked any further line of sight. Each action was smooth, patient, like a move made on a chessboard 10 turns before checkmate. Another hour passed. The hum of the engines deepened as the jet climbed into smoother air. Cabin lights dimmed slightly, bathing everything in the soft amber of late afternoon. Kalen slept soundly now, his small hand resting against Aleron's wrist. The cabin felt like a suspended world, too quiet, too still, as if anticipating a disruption no one had yet defined. And still Aleron waited. His training, his years building Milson dynamics, his entire professional life, had trained him not to react when prodded, but to respond when the stakes were clearest. And now, those stakes were beginning to reveal themselves. This wasn't about poor service. It wasn't about a laughing attendant. It wasn't even about a misplaced drink. Tern's behavior had crossed into something else, something that hinted at motive, not just malice. Aleron didn't know what Tern wanted, but he knew it wasn't just about the baby. A flight attendant doesn't glance at a briefcase that often unless he's been told to watch for something. Outside the window, the clouds parted enough to reveal the faint outline of the mountain range below. Inside, the tension thickened like fog. Aleron gently reached down and rechecked the strap of Kalen's carrier. Not because it was loose, but because he had learned long ago that safety is not just about security. It's about the feeling of control in a world where others try to remove it. His hand returned to rest beside the briefcase. And when Tern passed one final time, pausing slightly longer, eyes drifting, Aleron didn't look up. He didn't need to. The pattern was already complete. Disrespect often hides motives sharper than the insult itself. The jolt of turbulence had just begun to ripple through the cabin when Tern appeared again, this time with a forced urgency clinging to his voice. We're securing all items, he announced, voice rising above the hum of the jet engines. But his path didn't meander through the aisles like protocol would suggest. He walked directly toward seat 1A, toward Aleron and the infant carrier now buckled in at his side. No other passenger's laptop, meal tray, or personal bag had been touched, and many noticed. Yet Tern moved as if Kalen's carrier were a safety hazard unlike any other. Aleron immediately extended one arm across the aisle, blocking the approach with steady, unwavering precision. His eyes didn't widen. His voice didn't rise. It emerged low and deliberate, carrying the weight of someone who had navigated boardroom ambushes and survived far more dangerous turbulence than this. I'll secure my own child. Tern's smile faltered for the first time. A flicker of irritation curled the corners of his mouth. You're making this harder than it needs to be, he replied, words clipped, as though each one cut his tongue on the way out. Then, with a sudden motion meant to assert dominance, he reached forward and grabbed the top of the carrier, yanking it as though it were a misplaced gym bag. Gasps burst through the rows like a wave breaking against a hull. Kalen's tiny head jerked to the side from the abrupt tilt. The carrier wobbled dangerously. For one horrifying second, the baby's balance teetered. But Aleron was faster. His left hand shot forward with lightning accuracy, bracing the base of the carrier and steadying it before disaster struck. Passengers across first class froze. Some instinctively rose halfway from their seats. Others simply stared, eyes wide, mouths slightly agape, watching a father do what instincts had honed: protect. Alaron turned his head toward Turn, the calm still anchored in his tone, but there was no softness left beneath it. Touch him again without care, Alaron said, voice like steel under velvet. And this flight changes direction. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The ambient noise of the aircraft, the low of circulating air, the clink of glasses a few rows back, seemed to mute itself, as if the plane itself had taken a breath. Marvin Dalt, still standing a few paces behind Turn, shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't smirking this time. The look in his eyes was uncertain, flicking between the carrier and Turn's hand, trying to decide whether to step forward or back away. The spectacle had turned into something more dangerous than a joke gone wrong. Alaron slowly withdrew his arm from across the aisle, now keeping both hands near the carrier. Kalen had begun to stir, eyes fluttering. One small hand brushed Alaron's shirt as if to ask silently, "Is it over?" No, Alaron thought. Not yet. The eyes of the cabin were no longer passive. Witnesses had transformed. Their discomfort had solidified into something closer to silent allegiance. People who minutes ago buried their noses in books or magazines were now quietly watching every move Turn made. And Turn knew it. His shoulders squared slightly, but his breath caught a single, imperceptible hitch in his throat that didn't belong to confidence. Beneath his skin, a flicker of something new stirred. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't remorse. It was fear. Because Turn had seen something in Alaron's eyes he hadn't anticipated. Not rage, not weakness, but readiness. What he didn't know, what no one yet knew, was that Alaron had quietly activated a micro-recorder embedded in the ring on his index finger the moment the first jolt of turbulence began. A precaution, a pattern, a move made not from paranoia, but from lived wisdom. He wasn't reacting, he was documenting. The device had no blinking light, no sound cue, no giveaway. It simply recorded, capturing not just audio, but motion triggers and sound decibels. Every word, every rustle, every gasped reaction from the surrounding seats was now stored. And soon, if necessary, transmitted. Turn took a step back, brushing invisible lint off his vest, as if to restore dignity. But he could feel the air had shifted. He glanced down the aisle, avoiding passengers' eyes now. Alaron didn't move. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply adjusted Kalen's blanket gently, fingers smooth, slow, protective. His mind calculated multiple paths forward, each one measured, each one silently charted. This was no longer about a rude joke or a condescending laugh. This was about control, about someone who assumed a man traveling with a baby was vulnerable, and about a system that let that assumption fester unchecked. Turn thought the turbulence gave him the right to seize control. But he had just learned a hard truth in the quietest way possible. A calm man preparing is never as harmless as he looks. Turn returned during a lull in turbulence, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning the cabin like a warden planning a transfer. He moved with the stiff energy of someone pretending confidence, masking agitation behind a paper-thin layer of professionalism. The clipboard trembled slightly in his hand as he stopped by Alaron's row. He didn't look at the baby this time. He looked directly at Alaron, as if challenging something unspoken between them. "I need to relocate you," he said curtly, voice louder than necessary. "We have to balance weight distribution." The statement hung in the air like smoke. Several passengers looked up, brows furrowed. No other seats had been adjusted. The plane was stable. There was no mention of turbulence requiring movement. The request didn't feel procedural, it felt personal. Alaron raised his eyes slowly, meeting Turn's. "The only imbalance here," he said with quiet gravity, "is your conduct." The remark landed like a quiet strike. Turn's jaw twitched, but he forced a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Sir, this is standard," he muttered, though even he sounded unconvinced. Without waiting for permission, he reached out, faster this time, hand darting toward the carrier as though hoping speed would prevent resistance. But Alaron was faster. His hand moved instinctively, catching Turn's wrist mid-reach. The gesture wasn't violent, it was precise. Calm. His fingers locked around the flight attendant's wrist like a gate that had closed permanently. The effect was immediate. Gasps rippled from surrounding seats. A woman across the aisle covered her mouth. A man too rose back, whispered, "He's doing it again." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of judgment. Turn's eyes widened, not from pain, but from the realization that his moment of power had vanished in front of an audience. Oleron's voice, when it came, was soft enough to carry more weight than a shout. "You will not touch my child again." His grip released, not as a sign of surrender, but like a warning handed back gently, an act of restraint witnessed by too many eyes. Turn recoiled, stepping back as though the air itself had become heavy. His face flushed an angry red, not just from being stopped, but from being stopped so easily, so cleanly. His authority had not been wrestled, it had evaporated. Marvin Dalt, who had watched from behind with growing discomfort, took a hesitant step forward. His voice cracked slightly. "Turn, stop," he said under his breath, a plea more than a command. But the moment had already shifted beyond damage control. Something irreversible had happened. Turn had not just breached professional boundaries, he had crossed a moral one. And worse, he had done it in front of witnesses, now silently pulling out their phones, recording not just for safety, but for posterity. The lens of one camera caught the final flicker of defiance in Turn's eyes, the internal scramble to reclaim dignity that had already slipped through his fingers. He turned without another word and stormed back toward the galley, the clipboard clutched like a shield he no longer knew how to use. Unspoken tension filled the cabin. Eyes darted between Oleron and the aisle where Turn had vanished. But Oleron didn't move. He knelt slightly, adjusting the carrier strap with the care of a craftsman repairing something delicate. Kalen stirred softly, unbothered. In his father's calm, he found peace. Only then did Oleron glance around, noting the cameras, the shocked expressions, the subtle nods of passengers who now understood the stakes. No words were exchanged. None were needed. He returned to his seat with precision and grace, his thoughts already shifting forward. He didn't need confrontation to win. He needed patience. And patience, unlike panic, left no fingerprints. What Turn hadn't realized was that his downfall had already begun, not with a scream, but with a smile. It had started when he assumed no one important was watching. But now, every glance, every recording, every withheld comment was collecting weight. A slow tide, rising behind the man who had tried to bully a father protecting his child. Dramatic irony rippled across the scene. The man who mocked gentleness had been recorded by it, and the man he dismissed had allowed every mistake to gather quietly until the moment chose to speak for itself. Turn hadn't just touched a line, he had tripped over it. And as the atmosphere thickened with consequence, passengers leaned back, anticipating a shift they could all feel coming. A man who ignores warning after warning eventually walks into truth by himself. Turn stormed toward the cockpit with clenched fists and shoulders stiff like steel beams, his stride echoing through the hushed cabin. The air behind him quivered with tension. He leaned toward the closed door and rapped sharply. After a pause, the captain opened it slightly, and Turn squeezed inside, the door shutting behind him like the seal of a vault. The murmurs that followed weren't just gossip, they were memory taking shape. Passengers leaned into one another, trading fragments of what they'd seen, what they'd heard, and what they'd recorded. Behind that closed door, Turn's voice bled through in angry bursts. Being difficult, non-compliant, the baby thing is being exaggerated, but every syllable twisted into a lie that dissolved under the weight of digital truth. More than a dozen phones had captured the moment he yanked the infant's carrier. More than a dozen perspectives confirmed what the official narrative would now struggle to erase. Oleron didn't move. His eyes remained steady on Kalen, his hands adjusting the child's blanket with a gentleness that seemed to mock the chaos around them. The soft rise and fall of the baby's breath was the only rhythm that mattered. He was not worried, not because he underestimated the stakes, but because he had already anticipated them. Across the aisle, Ryden Voss leaned forward slightly, his voice low. "They're trying to flip the story," he said, watching the cockpit door with narrowed eyes. His tone wasn't panicked, just observant, like a man who had seen this kind of play before. "I know," Oleron replied, his voice even. He wasn't rattled. He wasn't rushing. He was waiting. Timing, as always, was everything. Moments later, the cockpit door opened with a soft hiss, and Captain Halden Rusk stepped out. He was tall, his uniform crisp, but his face bore the tension of a man walking into a room already filled with landmines. Behind him, Turn emerged with a practiced look of concern plastered across his features, as though he'd just received orders to act like a victim. The captain cleared his throat. "Dr. Miles," he began, but Turn cut in before he could continue. "Sir," Turn said loudly, voice laced with exaggerated professionalism. Your behavior is causing disruption on this flight. Alaron turned his head slowly, not rising, not reacting. He simply looked at Turn with the stillness of someone who had already won a battle the other man didn't realize had begun. My behavior, he said, voice calm but sharp. Or your mishandling of an infant? That question hung in the air like a wire pulled tight between towers. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was expectant. Several passengers shifted in their seats. One man in row 2B lifted his phone slightly, screen glowing. Another, seated near the exit row, raised his voice from behind his paper. We saw everything, he said firmly. A ripple moved through the cabin. He asked you to be gentle, another man added. You laughed. Captain Rusk hesitated, glancing between his attendant and the gathering chorus of passengers. The masked Turn wore, a mix of arrogance and fake confusion, began to slip at the edges. He hadn't counted on resistance. He certainly hadn't expected a collective voice. And yet, the most damning blow came not from those voices, but from the silent message vibrating on Alaron's wrist. He glanced at the watch briefly. A soft pulse, then a confirmation. The data from his ring, the footage of the incident, had just been uploaded successfully to the encrypted servers of Milson Dynamics. From that point on, no matter how the airline tried to spin it, the truth had its own wings. Turn saw none of this. His eyes were darting between the passengers, the captain, and Alaron, trying to read a room that was no longer under his control. Dramatic irony wrapped around him like an invisible rope. He was still performing, still believing he could contain a fire that had already spread. Alaron remained seated, posture relaxed, but his mind was sharpening. This wasn't about ego. It wasn't about proving himself. It was about protecting his child and ensuring no one ever used authority to justify abuse again. The captain looked ready to speak again, but hesitated. The moment no longer belonged to him. And, as Alaron gently rocked Kalen's carrier once more, the baby let out a soft sigh, undisturbed, unaware of how close chaos had come. The eyes in the cabin weren't on Turn anymore. They were on the father who had said nothing loudly, who had done nothing violently, and yet had shifted the entire axis of the flight. And above them all, circling quietly in the clouded altitudes of consequence, the truth had already begun moving ahead of the aircraft's trajectory. The truth was already flying faster than the plane itself. Sir, we're forced to issue a warning. The words hit like a flare across the tense silence of the cabin. Turn's voice was louder than necessary, deliberate in its projection. His stance was rigid, arms crossed just enough to feign professionalism, but the edge in his tone betrayed the intent, intimidation, not regulation. Alaron slowly turned his head, lifting his gaze without rising from his seat. Kalen shifted in his carrier with a faint sigh, sensing the subtle vibrations of conflict through his father's body. Alaron's hand moved instinctively to cradle the child's head, rocking him gently while his voice remained smooth and composed. A warning, Alaron repeated, his brow lifting ever so slightly. For protecting my child? Passengers tilted in their seats, drawn in not only by the confrontation, but by the growing sense that something was fundamentally unjust. Turn stood tall, but his eyes darted quickly toward the cockpit, as if hoping for backup or perhaps permission. But no one moved. Marvin Dalt, still stationed near the galley, shifted uncomfortably. His face bore the look of a man caught between orders and conscience. The silence stretched, heavy and waiting, until he finally stepped forward. His voice was quieter, uncertain. Captain Rusk, maybe we should review the footage they took, he suggested, glancing nervously toward the captain's door. Turn whipped around, glaring at him. There is no footage, he snapped. His voice was sharp, cutting off the suggestion like a knife. But the words hung hollow in the air, because at least 5 phones were still visibly recording. Passengers had angled their devices carefully, subtly, but with growing boldness as the situation escalated. Alaron knew they would. He had anticipated it. Turn didn't. Alaron remained still, eyes on the man before him, tracking each twitch of frustration that crossed Turn's face. Kalen stirred again, a quiet whimper escaping him as he nestled deeper into the carrier. Alaron's fingers smoothed the edge of the blanket. His movements were slow, deliberate, calm, but beneath them flowed a current of unwavering resolve. Turn raised his chin and took a step forward. This is your final chance to comply before we escalate further. And then came a moment no one had expected. A sharp voice, steady and lined with age, rose from the row just behind Oleron. If he goes, then half of us go. Every head turned. A man in his 60s, clean-shaven with a deep voice and a pilot's posture, stood slowly. His name was Darren Kelver, though few on board knew that yet. What they saw was confidence, quiet authority, and eyes that had watched long enough. He's done nothing wrong, Darren continued, locking eyes with Tern. We all saw what happened. We heard him ask you to be gentle. We saw you ignore it. Tern's mouth opened, then shut again. His hands clenched. The tone of the cabin changed like wind before storm. Every passenger watching now, not as spectators, but as silent jurors. One row back, a man in glasses murmured, "That baby could have been hurt." Another voice, firm, low, added, "Enough is enough." Oleron didn't speak. He let the cabin speak for him. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with resolve. Tern, flustered, turned toward the cockpit door again, hoping for Captain Rusk to emerge and tip the scale. But the door remained closed. The sound of Kalen's soft breathing filled the pause. A baby's calmness often says more than any adult's fury. Marvin took another step forward, his voice low now. Maybe it's time to step back. But Tern wasn't ready to surrender his grip on the situation. You're all being misled, he hissed. You don't understand how flight safety works. We understand decency, Darren Kelver cut in. And we understand when someone's being bullied. Tern's posture broke slightly, one shoulder dropping as uncertainty finally took hold. He scanned the cabin, looking for even one face to nod in agreement. None did. Ryden Voss, who had remained silent thus far, leaned slightly into the aisle and tapped his phone screen, ensuring the video was still recording. Oleron finally spoke again, his voice as calm as ever. This could have been handled with professionalism. It still can. But if your next move involves removing me for defending my son's safety, you won't just be explaining it to me. Tern swallowed hard. Something in Oleron's tone was harder than warning. It was the quiet gravity of a man who had nothing left to prove, only truth left to reveal. For the first time, Tern glanced at the carrier with a flicker of something like regret, or maybe fear. Then the cabin returned to stillness. No one moved. No one blinked. A silence thicker than any turbulence fell. A pause where time stretched thin enough to snap. Oleron's eyes didn't leave Tern. He hadn't stood. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't resisted physically. But every moment had tilted in his favor, not through force, but through restraint and through the gathering of undeniable witnesses. Even Kalen's soft cooing in that moment seemed like punctuation, a quiet signal that the storm had passed its eye and was now circling back toward its true source. Oleron remained seated, calm, collected. He understood momentum. He understood pressure. He understood timing. And the timing was now shifting in his direction. Sometimes the strongest move is choosing not to move at all. He smirked, confident the CEO's plea was meaningless, unaware that every witness, every recording, and every legal channel had already aligned to turn a moment of mockery into an undeniable liability. If you believe cruelty under privilege always folds when strategy and consequence collide, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. Tern stepped into the aisle with hurried aggression, his voice rising above the steady hum of the aircraft. The baby's carrier was loose, he announced, trying to mask desperation with authority. His voice cracked slightly on the word loose, and passengers turned, some frowning, others startled. The claim hit the cabin like a false alarm, sharp, loud, and immediately suspicious. Oleron didn't stand. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes said more than a raised voice ever could. He remained seated, one hand gently resting on the edge of Kalen's carrier, the other poised on the armrest, like a conductor awaiting the next note in a symphony he already understood. His composure radiated something unshakable, and for the first time, Tern seemed to notice it. Across the aisle, Ryden Voss stood. The quiet man who had watched everything unfold now spoke with calm, deliberate power. "We saw you yank it," he said, his voice cutting through the cabin like a blade through fog. Murmurs rose as others nodded. One man added, "You nearly knocked the baby sideways." Tern blinked. His eyes darted around the rows, searching for someone, anyone, to validate his claim. But none came. The smirk he had worn earlier was gone, replaced by a tautness in his jaw and beads of sweat forming near his hairline. His hands twitched at his sides, unsure whether to defend himself or retreat. Captain Halden Rusk approached from the cockpit, his posture weary but alert. His eyes shifted from Tern to Oleron, then to the passengers. "Is this accurate?" he asked, his voice low but firm. The words weighed with growing concern. Tern opened his mouth, but nothing coherent came out. There was movement, he stammered, but the momentum had shifted. His own story had no witnesses. Just echoes of arrogance, now collapsing into doubt. Marvin Dalt, who had until now remained frozen in the galley's shadow, finally lowered his gaze. His voice was barely audible. "Went too far," he said, the weight of truth pressing down on him like gravity, made visible. He didn't look at Tern. He couldn't. Oleron didn't speak. He didn't need to. This was a moment for silence, a silence that allowed the truth to settle like dust after a storm. He gently adjusted Kalen's blanket, the soft rustle of fabric oddly loud in the quieted cabin. Captain Rusk's brow furrowed as he stepped forward. "Both of you," he gestured to the attendants, "step aside while I gather statements." His voice had changed. No longer neutral. It held a restrained sternness, like a father who realized too late that his trust had been misplaced. The aisle became a courtroom, the cabin its jury. Passengers volunteered details, each recollection piecing together the same story. The truth was not complicated. It was visible, filmed, and felt. Oleron reached into his coat and pulled out his ring, subtly detaching the top and revealing the recording mechanism beneath. "This captured everything," he said, offering it with calm clarity. No grand gesture, no theatrics, just a man offering proof. Captain Rusk accepted it cautiously, as if the object itself held weight. He stepped into a quiet alcove near the galley and reviewed the footage. As he watched, his expression changed, first to disbelief, then to discomfort, and finally to something more serious. His lips parted slightly, as if trying to find words, but settling for none. When he returned, he looked visibly shaken. "This is serious," he muttered under his breath, as though admitting it out loud might shift the air around him. Oleron met his gaze, eyes clear and unwavering. It became serious the moment he laughed at a father asking for gentleness. Captain Rusk didn't respond. He didn't have to. He turned away, stepping back toward the cockpit to notify ground command, shoulders no longer squared but heavy with the weight of responsibility. Behind him, Tern stood rooted in place, his authority drained, his uniform suddenly looking like a costume instead of a role. The laughter he once used like a weapon had betrayed him, and in its place stood something more permanent, a mistake caught in motion, played back from 5 angles, now living beyond him. A single careless moment can echo louder than a lifetime of excuses. The chime struck the cabin like a sudden drop in altitude, sharp, unexpected, unnerving. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," came the voice of Captain Rusk, his tone unusually clipped. "We've been instructed to prepare for a diversion. We'll be landing in Valmora City for an immediate crew review." The announcement hung in the air like fog. For a moment, no one moved. Then the silence fractured into low gasps, exchanged glances, and rustling seatbelts. Several passengers leaned toward their windows, confirming that the plane had begun a subtle but undeniable shift in course. Oleron Miles didn't flinch. He sat with calm precision, rocking Kalen's carrier gently, as if turbulence and tension belonged to another world. But beneath that stillness, his mind moved with precision. The upload from his encrypted ring recorder had done its job, triggering a chain reaction at Mileson Dynamics. And given the medical transport partnership worth $32 million on the line, he knew Astrian Air's headquarters would not stay passive for long. Just across the aisle, Tern's face had drained of color. His fingers twitched at his vest buttons, fumbling them back into place. He leaned down sharply toward Marvin. "You said this wouldn't get out of hand," he hissed, breath hot with panic. Marvin's shoulders stiffened, but he didn't look at him. His voice was barely a whisper, yet every syllable struck clean. "You made it get out of hand." Tern straightened abruptly, eyes scanning the cabin. Passengers were no longer passengers. They had become quiet judges. The weight of their gazes was unmistakable. Their earlier sympathy had now crystallized into something sharper, memory, a shared, undeniable record of his actions. He tried to move down the aisle, pretending to check seatbelts, anything to recapture a sense of control. But people leaned away. One man discreetly turned his phone toward the aisle, recording. Another gave a stiff shake of the head when Tern passed by. The tide had turned, and he knew it. Captain Rusk exited the cockpit briefly, speaking quietly with the lead engineer near the galley. His posture, usually upright and commanding, was now cautious, even withdrawn. He stole a glance at Oleron, but quickly turned away, as if eye contact alone might implicate him. It was clear. Even he had begun to calculate how far this would ripple beyond the cabin walls. In contrast, Oleron remained composed, gently adjusting the soft navy blanket over his sleeping son. Kalen stirred only slightly, oblivious to the storm his safety had just set in motion. To any onlooker, Oleron was a father at peace. But within, he was measuring outcomes, calculating what the diversion meant, who had been alerted, and what steps would follow once they landed. The cabin crew attempted to proceed with routine tasks. A cart rattled unevenly down the aisle. Marvin offered water with a hollow expression, each interaction mechanical. Even a light clink of plastic cups couldn't mask the underlying tension, like an orchestra trying to play through a fire alarm. Near the rear, two passengers whispered, "Do you think they're going to arrest him?" "No, but he's in serious trouble. That man warned him twice. We all saw it." Oleron heard none of it, but he didn't need to. He could feel the shift in the cabin, the gravitational pull of consequence. Tern returned to the front, trying to appear collected. But he wasn't. His stride had lost its rhythm. His hands moved too quickly, smoothing his vest, adjusting his badge, checking the overhead compartments though none needed attention. It was performance now, not procedure. As he reached his jump seat, he paused, staring out the small window. Clouds rolled past, unaware. Tern looked at his reflection, drawn, pale, and twitching at the edges. The reflection didn't smirk back at him anymore. He turned again, eyes flicking to Oleron. But Oleron wasn't looking at him. He was looking at Kalen, gently stroking the back of his son's tiny hand with his thumb. The serenity on his face was not detachment, it was discipline. It was focus honed by years of decisions that carried weight. This wasn't new to him. This was strategy. Tern, for the first time, understood who he had been up against. Not just a passenger, but a man used to being heard without shouting. A man whose calm had teeth. Back in the galley, Marvin leaned against the sidewall, eyes shut briefly as if trying to disappear. Guilt pressed down on his chest like altitude. He had watched the line cross in real time, watched it tilt toward danger, and said nothing until it was too late. Now his silence had attached him to a sinking raft. Meanwhile, Oleron's watch vibrated softly. A secure alert from Milson Dynamics pulsed once. Upload confirmed. Priority flagged by legal division. External contact. Astrionair executive thread opened. He tapped the message closed without expression. Outside, Velmora City's skyline began to emerge, faint in the clouds, but real. The descent had begun. The change was no longer hypothetical. It was kinetic. Every passenger felt it now. Something larger than travel was in motion. The hum of the engines carried an undercurrent of inevitability. They weren't just arriving at another airport. They were arriving at the hinge of accountability. Tern sat still, now fully aware that every effort to bury the truth had only brought it closer to the surface. And Oleron, without ever raising his voice or his hand, had shifted the entire altitude of consequence. A plane does not need turbulence to shake those who built their authority on sand. The cabin jolted slightly as the landing gear deployed, but the real turbulence was inside. Not from the wind. This storm had been building at 30,000 feet and was now descending fast toward ground-level consequence. As the plane leveled for its approach into Velmora City, tension thickened like fog clinging to the walls of a courtroom before a verdict. Passengers sat rigid, eyes flitting toward the front galley, where whispers had long since turned to heavy silence. Tern stood by the cockpit, his mouth dry, hands twitching at his vest buttons. He smoothed his hair again, trying to find the composure he had once worn like a second skin. But authority, once fractured, doesn't fit the same way twice. Below, through narrow cabin windows, the silhouettes of uniformed airline security officers came into view, lined beside a black van marked with the Astrionair insignia. Beside them stood two men in charcoal suits, investigators. No flashing lights, no drama, just quiet certainty, like chess pieces set in place before the final move. The aircraft hissed as it rolled to a stop on the tarmac. Tern inhaled once, sharply, as if he could reset the moment with breath alone. He stepped forward just as the front cabin door unsealed with a hiss of pressure and metal. The investigators boarded immediately. They didn't look at him. They didn't ask for his side. They scanned the rows like surgeons scanning a patient, their gaze clinical and searching. Their eyes landed first on Oleron Miles. He hadn't moved. Kalen still rested beside him in the carrier, swaddled and asleep. Aleron's hands were calmly folded. His expression hadn't changed since boarding, quiet, composed, and controlled. But that quiet had never been weakness. It was architecture, measured restraint holding back a flood. One of the investigators, a tall, silver-haired man with a badge that read Soren Vale, led Operations Integrity, turned slowly as Tern tried to intercept him. This passenger, Tern began, his voice strained, reaching for justification before accusation could rise. Vale didn't flinch. He raised a hand and cut him off mid-sentence. "We've already received the preliminary footage," he said, voice crisp as ice. "We're not here for opinions." Tern froze. His breath caught. The air seemed to shift sideways. All the rehearsed lines, the explanations he had prepared, evaporated like mist under a rising sun. He turned slightly toward Marvin, but the younger attendant stood stone still, avoiding his gaze. Vale and his associate approached Aleron. "Dr. Miles," Vale began, his tone now one of measured professionalism. "Can you recount the sequence of events for the record?" Aleron nodded. "No teatrix. No anger." He spoke in clean, even sentences that fell like the ticking of a precise clock. He described the initial exchange, the laughter, the comment, the first rough inspection. Then the turbulence, the deliberate mishandling of Kalen's carrier, the false claim of weight redistribution, the attempted forced relocation, and finally, the dangerous yank that nearly caused injury. His tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. In the silence of a cabin filled with listening ears, calm became the sharpest blade. The investigators turned to the witnesses. Raiden Voss spoke first, with the quiet authority of a man who had waited long enough to make his words count. Others followed, each confirming what Aleron had described, each voice adding weight to a truth already anchored. Then came the moment Tern had feared, but never truly believed would happen. Marvin Dalt stepped forward. The galley attendant's eyes were rimmed with exhaustion, but something else sat in them too, resolve. He didn't look at Tern when he spoke. He looked straight at Vale. He went too far, Marvin admitted, voice low. "I should have stepped in sooner." Tern didn't move. He felt as if gravity itself had turned against him. The floor no longer felt steady. Even the air was too thick to breathe. Vale nodded once. "That will be noted in the report." Then came the final blow. The second investigator, a sharp-eyed man with a slate tablet in his hand, looked up from the scrolling file. Due to the pending partnership between Astraenair's Medical Transport Division and Milson Dynamics, he announced clearly, the airline's legal division has flagged this incident for executive-level breach review. Silence. Tern blinked, the words swimming in his ears. The context struck him like a bell rung too close to the head. Not only had he lost control, he had placed the airline's most sensitive upcoming deal in jeopardy. A deal worth tens of millions. A deal that could affect fleet expansion, medical airlifts, government contracts. His laugh at a father's request had become a fracture line through an empire. No one moved to help him. And now, as the moments unraveled, he saw it all, how every choice, every word, every smirk had led him here. Aleron's silence had not been passivity. It had been a trap made of patience and precision. And now that trap had sprung. The lead investigator closed his folder. Tern's shoulders sagged. No one raised their voice. No one had to. Truth had taken a microphone. And in its presence, every excuse sounded like static. Some mistakes cost more than a career. They cost the ground beneath it. Tern was escorted off the aircraft, not in handcuffs, but under a silence so thick it seemed to weigh down the aisle with every step. His once arrogant posture had collapsed into something between a shuffle and a retreat, his eyes darting but finding no refuge in the faces that followed him. Each passenger he passed turned slightly away, not in fear, but in quiet judgment. The door hissed open behind him, and cold tarmac air slipped into the fuselage like the final exhale of a dying authority. Marvin Dalt followed voluntarily, steps slower, as if reluctant to admit where his loyalty had brought him. Shame rode heavy in his spine. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence was an unspoken confession, and everyone aboard heard it loud and clear. The passengers began to disembark next, one by one, each pausing at row 1, not to gather belongings, but to acknowledge the man who had changed the course of the flight without raising his voice. Aleron remained seated, Kalen now awake and resting gently against his chest, blinking slowly in the diffused sunlight, bleeding through the open hatch. A nod from one passenger. A quiet, "thank you" from another. Even the silent ones offered something, an approving glance, a subtle salute of solidarity. Every gesture, no matter how small, was louder than Turn's earlier laughter had ever been. Raiden Voss paused just before stepping off the plane. He glanced back at Alaron with an expression somewhere between admiration and relief. "You handled this with more discipline than most men could," he said, his voice low and sincere, the words earned and true. Alaron offered a quiet nod, adjusting the carrier strap around his shoulder as he slowly stood. Kalen reached up with one tiny hand and gripped the edge of his father's collar, an innocent, grounding act in a world that had just felt its balance shift. As father and son stepped into the daylight, the mood outside the aircraft sharpened. On the tarmac, beneath the metallic wing of Flight 742, stood a line of men in dark suits, their jackets fluttering lightly in the morning breeze. Each bore the insignia of Austrian Air, but none bore the expressions of calm. These were not low-level administrators, they were senior executives. And they had not come for turn. They were waiting for Alaron. Director Sovereign Kale stood at the front of the line, tall and stern with silvered temples and a tight grip on the tablet under his arm. As Alaron approached, Kale stepped forward briskly and extended his hand. "Dr. Miles," he said, his voice formal but laden with urgency. "We have reviewed what occurred. On behalf of Austrian Air, I extend formal apologies." Alaron met the man's hand but didn't speak. His grip was firm, but his silence spoke louder than any reply. He let the moment breathe, watching Kale closely, noting the faint tremor in his jaw, the tension in his shoulders, signs of a man walking a corporate tightrope. Kale pressed on. "Beyond that," he said, his voice softer now, "we request that you allow us to meet with you privately regarding the proposed medical transport partnership and the breach of conduct that may affect its standing." The subtext was clear. The footage had traveled faster than any plane. Somewhere in the boardroom above, the $32 million deal had been flagged. Warnings had been issued, and now, in a rare reversal of power, it was not Alaron seeking their approval. It was they who stood in silent plea for his grace. Alaron's gaze didn't waver. He shifted Kalen gently, the baby's soft breaths a steady metronome against his chest. He understood exactly what was happening. The airline didn't just fear the media backlash. They feared the legal fallout. They feared the potential partnership unraveling. They feared him, not because he had shouted, but because he hadn't needed to. He tilted his head slightly, just enough to shift the dynamic again. "I'll listen," he said finally, his tone even. "But understand this, what I care about isn't image repair. It's responsibility." A flicker of something passed through Director Kale's face. Respect, maybe, or recognition that they were not dealing with a man who could be silenced with corporate jargon or hollow appeasement. He nodded. "We'll arrange a private room inside the executive terminal," Kale said. Alaron turned slightly, taking in the morning sun, the stretch of runway, the ripple of whispers behind him. The world hadn't exploded. It had shifted just slightly because one man refused to bend when it mattered most. Passengers continued down the ramp behind him. A few snapped photos, not of the plane or the skyline, but of the man cradling a child whose quiet safety had become the turning point of a million-dollar conversation. Alaron waited. He didn't rush. He let the moment speak for itself. And when Kale gestured for him to follow, he stepped forward, not as a client, not as a complainant, but as someone whose silence had rewritten the roles. And somewhere behind them, inside a silent flight deck, an empty seat still bore the imprint of a man who laughed when told to be gentle. A man's response shapes his legacy more than any apology can. The door to the conference room closed with a quiet click, sealing the room in sterile tension. Alaron Miles didn't speak right away. He didn't need to. The men across from him already looked uneasy. 3 senior board members, a legal advisor, 2 operations directors, and Director Sovereign Kale at the center, his fingers clasped so tightly together the knuckles had gone pale. Between them, a large glass table stretched like a cold divide. Screens along the back wall displayed frozen stills from different angles, passenger phone footage, frame-by-frame close-ups, and a paused loop from the ring recorder. In each image, Turn's smirk hung like a noose above professionalism. Kalen slept soundly in a navy bassinet beside his father, unaware of the monumental meeting unfolding mere feet away. Alaron sat motionless, one hand gently rocking the edge of the bassinet, the other folded in calm readiness. He wore no tie. He didn't need armor. His presence alone unsettled the room. Director Kale cleared his throat, glancing quickly at the screens before locking eyes with Aileron. Dr. Miles, we want to begin by acknowledging what happened on Flight 742 was unacceptable. We cannot undo it, but we are prepared to take responsibility. Aileron said nothing. The contract, originally valued at $32 million, Kale continued, depends entirely on our ability to work with Milestone Dynamics in the long term. The board understands if, under these circumstances, you choose to withdraw. Silence settled like dust. One of the operations directors shifted uncomfortably. The legal advisor scribbled something in a leather notebook but didn't speak. Aileron finally leaned back in his chair. His voice, when it came, was smooth but unyielding. This partnership was never about dollars. It was about distribution access for life-saving biotech. For patients. For families. For those in fragile states who can't afford mishandling. Not from airlines. Not from anyone. Kale nodded slowly, visibly digesting each word. Understood. Aileron's gaze drifted to the paused footage behind them, turn yanking the carrier mid-turbulence. Marvin flinching. Kalen jerking to the side. Trust, he said, voice harder now, is earned not by handshakes but by how you treat those with no voice. That includes infants. He let the sentence breathe. If a 5-month-old isn't safe on your aircraft, then how can we entrust you with medical transport systems? The question hovered like a blade over the table. Ryden Voss, seated in the back as a silent guest witness and now officially a Milestone advisor, nodded in quiet approval. Aileron reached into his briefcase, not for documents, but a single folder labeled in clean silver embossing. Operational Reforms Proposal. He slid across the glass. Kale hesitated before accepting it. As he opened it, Aileron continued. This outlines a complete behavioral audit framework for long-haul crew. Psychological screenings. Yentlanding certification. Updated disciplinary thresholds for conduct violations. I've also included criteria for what I call visible integrity protocols, automatic upload requirements, so that truth isn't dependent on luck or courage of passengers. The room was completely still. The legal advisor looked up sharply. You're proposing this as part of the new contract? Aileron nodded. I'm not proposing. I'm requiring it. Kale exhaled, glancing through the pages. Each point was detailed, methodical, unclouded by emotion, yet impossible to misinterpret. This wasn't a vendetta. It was a reformation plan. Dr. Miles, Kale began, his voice cracking slightly, these measures go beyond anything we've seen in standard aviation practice. Aileron leaned forward. That's the point. The statement struck home. Tension splintered through the boardroom. One of the operations directors looked at the footage again, then closed his eyes briefly, ashamed. Another board member, older, perhaps retired military by posture, spoke up. I've been in this business for 30 years, he said. I've never seen a passenger carry himself the way you did under pressure. Nor have I seen a crew member implode so publicly. This, Miles' protocol, is it? Aileron inclined his head. I'll vote to implement it, the man said. Kale looked around the table. One by one, heads nodded. And what are the individuals involved? Aileron asked quietly. Kale didn't hesitate. Both have been placed on immediate suspension. Following today, they will be removed permanently from all flight operations and terminated from Austrian Air's internal staffing list. That includes blacklist notification across our partner charter and commercial networks. Aileron offered the smallest of nods, measured, not triumphant. He hadn't come for revenge. He had come to ensure the future looked different than the past. Very well, he said at last. Then the partnership remains under the new conditions. The legal advisor raised an eyebrow, but didn't challenge it. Ryden Voss watched the scene with quiet respect. He had seen what happened in the cabin, the injustice, the restraint, the tipping point, and now saw the same composure translated into institutional change. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was absolute. Kale stood, the rest following. No handshakes yet, only acknowledgments. Aileron gathered his folder, adjusted Kalen's blanket, and turned toward the exit. The board remained frozen for a long moment after he left, like men who had just stood at the edge of something greater than they understood. Respect must become a requirement, not a request. The press release hit the aviation world like a lightning strike. Austrian Air's executive division had just published the formal introduction of the Miles Protocol. The document, over 40 pages long, wasn't just a set of policy updates. It was a public admission. A reform package that included mandatory gentleness certification for any crew member handling infants, a strict behavioral evaluation cycle for flight attendants every 6 months, and, perhaps most controversial, a system-wide implementation of automatic footage uploads for any passenger safety dispute. It was unprecedented. Industry veterans whispered about it in conference rooms. Passenger rights groups called it historic. But for Dr. Alaron Miles, it was simply necessary. He read the headline from the quiet of his home office, Kaylin resting in his arms. The baby's breath rose and fell in tiny, even waves. Outside, the morning sun painted soft stripes across the oak floor. Alaron didn't move. He didn't smile. He simply closed the tablet and exhaled. He hadn't spoken to the press. He had declined the interviews, the invitations to sit across glossy studio tables. Hero Father Reforms Aviation, one producer had pitched. The Man Who Stayed Silent and Changed Everything, another had written. But Alaron knew that was never the point. What mattered wasn't applause. It was protection. A soft knock on his study door preceded a familiar voice, his legal advisor and longtime friend, Draven Holt. "It's official," Draven said as he entered, holding a printed copy of the policy announcement. "They're calling it the gold standard for infant passenger safety." Alaron nodded once, shifting Kaylin slightly. "Good," he said. "Now let's hope it lasts." Draven pulled up a chair, setting the paper down carefully. "You know this doesn't happen without pressure, without you refusing to let it die quietly, without that meeting at the Aerocentric Center." Alaron's gaze drifted to the edge of the room, where the bassinet stood unused. Kaylin had fallen asleep in his arms instead. "I didn't raise my voice, Draven. I didn't threaten anyone. I just made it clear that if they valued their contract more than their conduct, they'd have to prove it." Draven smiled faintly, the corners of his eyes tightening. "And they did. Director Kale has already initiated a task force to audit similar behavior patterns across all long-haul crew. It's rattling cages." Alaron's fingers gently traced Kaylin's back. "Good. Then they're finally hearing the silence." There had been no courtroom drama. No viral confrontation. Just a quiet series of documents, encrypted uploads, witness testimonies, and one father who refused to let disrespect go unnoticed. At Air's headquarters, compliance officers now reviewed the protocols line by line. Training officers rewrote manuals. Legal departments redrafted liability clauses. And behind it all was the unmistakable whisper of the Miles name, not loud, not boastful, but firm, echoing through policy decisions and boardroom walls. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Alaron stepped onto the back patio. The wind was gentle, the kind that didn't try to prove itself. He looked down at Kaylin, now curled peacefully in a navy blanket, the same one from Flight 742. The child yawned, unconcerned by the legacy forming beneath his tiny feet. The world had changed around him. Airlines had begun calling Air to request insights into their protocol model. A quiet shift had begun. Policies that once only existed to protect companies were now being adapted to protect passengers, especially the smallest ones. Still, Alaron stayed out of sight. The camera crews, still parked outside the office of Miles & Dynamics, were slowly packing up. There was no press tour, no televised statement, only internal memos, quiet implementations, and the gravity of what restraint had achieved. Weeks passed, but the question kept returning. At a closed-door summit for biotech executives, a peer finally asked it. "How did you stay so composed, Alaron? With all that disrespect?" Alaron, dressed simply, looked across the table, his voice low and steady. "Because my son was watching," he said. "And boys learn from what men choose to do." The room went quiet, and somewhere in the distance, a storm the world had braced for never arrived. Not because the winds didn't come, but because someone had quietly redirected their course with strength that needed no volume. Gentleness, when protected, becomes a force stronger than any storm. The silence hit the cabin, the fine was issued, and the airline paid $32 million for their negligence. If you believe true authority combines calm, preparation, and decisive action, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights prejudice, arrogance, and the consequences that follow when ignorance meets authority and accountability. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, responsibility, and respect for every family and passenger.